Hello and welcome to Weird Together. I'm Brenna Storr, host of the Ghost Story Guys podcast.
I'm Joseph Camo, a tenured sociology professor and host of the Sociology Professor YouTube channel.
And this is a show where we talk about the sociology behind the latest and greatest in independent horror films. We're not critics.
We're not experts.
We're just weird. Together. Joseph, my friend, it occurs to me with the new intro to the show, because we're focusing on sociology now. We've always made that a component of the show, but that's now actually a main focus of the show, that one of us is actually an expert. But just so you know, I'm not rewriting the intro.
Okay, that's fair. I think you're an expert on something, Bren. Like, I'm not sure what, but we'll leave that open to interpretation.
Dishwasher goes whoosh. We talked about this.
Yes, that's fair. That's fair.
How you been, my friend?
I'm good. Yeah, I was telling you off air, I got a dog, which is, he's sitting at my feet, so that's kind of fun. I think, when you have kids who are very smart, sometimes that comes back at you. And my 12-year-old son's like, "Daddy, did you get the dog because, to help alleviate the loneliness in your heart when we're gone?"
Ooh.
Ouch. Smart kid.
Does he want to be on a podcast?
Right? Maybe at some point. So, no, but I got a dog, which is probably good because I've also developed high blood pressure, which it's funny, you and I've talked in the past, I've made a number of healthy changes in my life, lost a good bit of weight in the last couple of years. And it's like, I went to the universe and said, "Hey, guess what? I'm lost weight, exercising more." And the universe is like, "Very good. I shall reward you with high blood pressure." It's just like I had before those changes, I didn't have it. I know as you age, that just happens. So maybe this pup will help ease the anxiety or stress or whatever it is that's leading to that. So, but overall, I'm good. How about you, Bren?
Well, Joseph, I've avoided having high blood pressure by not going to the doctor. So who is stupid now?
Well, very, very, very well done. Nice.
Yep, that'll show you. No, I'm good. I'm back here in London, Ontario. I've been working away. I've got a major writing project that I'm working on and have been for a couple months now. I'm starting a new podcast with Brandon Scheck-Snyder, host of Southern Gothic. And it is a short horror fiction podcast that will begin in September. Now, we've just signed to a network. We're finishing the paperwork now, so we're not talking about the name of it or anything, but it is a short horror fiction that is paranormal in nature. So the idea is that it is set in the 1990s and before, and the exact architecture of it, I'll wait to reveal until there's a trailer up. But there is a finished episode. I will send it to you so you can hear what it sounds like. And I basically have to write over the course of 12 months, or over the course of a year and a bit, I have to write 500 plus pieces of flash fiction. I have written roughly 10% so far. I've written 54 pieces of flash fiction, about 240 pages, all told.
I'm an academic by trade, and you're doing more writing than I am. I'll just say that.
I got to say, man, it's nice to hear you say that, because the volume of what I have to produce is so substantial that all I can think about is how little I've done. So that I've written 240 pages since January is good. And hearing that from an actual academic and not just, dishwasher goes whoosh, that is reassuring.
I'm glad I can help.
But for now, we are here to talk about, of course, an independent horror film. It is relatively new to streaming, although it was released last year. That film is Larry Fessenden's Blackout. According to IMDb, Blackout tells the story of Charlie, an artist who is convinced that he is a werewolf wreaking havoc on a small American town under the full moon. Now, before we get into the conversation, you should know that we spoil the hell out of these movies, so if you want to see Blackout completely clean, which I recommend you do, I think Blackout is a fantastic film, you're going to want to do that now. But I'm very much of the belief that spoilers do not make a film unwatchable, that you can enjoy the experience of a film even knowing full well what happens. And so with that in mind, we're going to do that thing we do here on Weird Together, where we acknowledge that you never see a film in a vacuum. You go in with your expectations, with the day you had. You go in with a lot of baggage. Joseph, my friend, what, if any, baggage did you have going into Blackout?
So, the main thing obviously was we had already reviewed a film that starred Larry Fessenden, Brooklyn 45, right? So,
yes.
And you are more familiar with his work than I am, but certainly we enjoyed that film. So I went into it with maybe with a little more favorable kind of view, just, with him in mind. And it was certainly interesting in the film. Then you see Jeremy Holm, who was also in Brooklyn 45. You're like, I know this guy, in a very different role there.
Very different, yeah.
So, yeah. So I went into it with generally a positive view. And then werewolf films aren't super common these days, maybe because it's kind of been played out, because there's not a lot new to be done with them. Typically, there's a number of things you could say about that. So we hadn't really reviewed one before, so it was really kind of novel and interesting to go into a film with a different kind of lore to it than what we usually do.
Fair enough, yeah. So for me, I went in with a fair bit of baggage. Obviously, yeah, we've reviewed Brooklyn 45 on this show, which I recommend, if you haven't watched, I recommend watching it. And Vinegar Syndrome is either in the process, I believe it's at least available for sale through them. I don't know if they're the one producing it, but there is a lovely Blu-ray of Brooklyn 45 being released with a lot of special features. So if you, like me, are a fan of independent cinema and physical media, I recommend picking up Brooklyn 45. Aside from that, I have a lot of respect for Larry Fessenden. Of course, I don't know him as a person, but I have listened to a number of interviews he's done, and through his production company, Glass Eye Pix, he has really done a lot to elevate the voices of independent creators. He's very good at helping people make movies for very little money. And I have always been a big fan of people who use their platform to help elevate the voices of others. And so just on the basis of that alone, I've got a lot of respect for Fessenden. And I genuinely enjoy when he turns up and stuff. So, as you mentioned, Brooklyn 45. And then I was lucky enough to see Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon in theaters back in, I want to say, October. And Fessenden turns up in the end. And that was a very, very cool surprise. So I'm typically in the bag for Fessenden stuff. And I do like werewolf movies. Bad Moon, the Howling films, not all of the Howling films, but a number of the Howling films and things like this. There's actually one, I think it's called The Cursed. It came out a few years ago, starring Boyd Holbrook. If you like werewolf movies, check it out. It's surprisingly great. I think part of the reason they don't make them as much anymore is I don't think they sell as well, at least not at the big budget level. I know there was that really, really expensive Benicio del Toro film directed by Joe Johnston called The Wolfman. It was sort of like a mega budget adaptation of the Universal Monsters Wolfman. And it did terribly because audiences just don't seem to turn on for that stuff. But I was even a fan of that. So again, love me a good werewolf movie. Big fan of Larry Fessenden. So I went into this one very hopeful. I never go into a movie hoping I'll dislike it. I think hate watching things is bullshit. We have a limited amount of time on this island Earth, and I think for Christ's sakes, just enjoy things. But even so, I went into this one very enthusiastic. Now, of course, the question is, was that enthusiasm borne out? Did Blackout reward the 2 times I paid to rent it for this show? And there's only one place gentlemen such as us can have that conversation, and that's the Toctagon. Welcome to the Toctagon. 2 men enter, 2 men leave. All right, Joseph. So, why don't you get us started talking about Blackout?
Yeah, overall, I enjoyed the film. Maybe there was points where it got a little bit slow, but overall, I enjoyed it. And I thought Charlie's mission to end the nightmare for him and others of his life as a werewolf was sort of an interesting frame for the story, right? It wasn't just the simple cliche, there's a werewolf who's just out there and then someone else is trying to end him. This is a person who is aware enough of what he's doing that is no one else is aware really of him, and he is the one who's actively planning his own demise. Obviously, huge spoiler here. So I thought that was an interesting spin on it, right? This very person who's very self-aware and has a plan to end the horror of his werewolfdom.
The film was much more melancholy than I expected. And I suppose, looking back over Fessenden's work, which I haven't seen a lot of, but I've seen enough of it. I suppose I should have expected that. He rarely does a straightforward take on these things. It's more a little bit like what we do here. He wants to examine the things under the skin. The work of composer Will Bates, I believe was his name. Will Bates, yeah, was particularly great. I actually had if there's a hard copy of this, I will buy it. I don't think there is at the moment, but if a company like Vinegar Syndrome or Severin or whoever does a hard copy of this, I'll buy it. I don't know how much I'll watch it, because I actually found the film pretty emotionally affecting. But even so, I really admired what he did there. And yeah, the first time I watched it, I thought, yeah, I had the same thought, a little bit slow. But the second time I watched it, I think I was able to kind of relax into it in a different way. It's like recently I saw The Fall Guy, that big action comedy that's in theaters right now. And the first time I watched it, I loved it. But there was a couple moments where I thought the filmmakers were going to do these really lazy things that some filmmakers do with the story. And so I was kind of tensing up for those things, because not because they're scary, but because they're boring and stupid. And it's just, when people go for it, you think, okay, we've done this a million times. But then after the scenes ended, I realized, no, they weren't doing that at all. So I'd kind of wasted that tension. And when I went back a second time, I was much more able to enjoy the film for what it is. And I've since seen The Fall Guy 4 times.
Okay.
But, yeah. But anyways, yeah. So I was able to appreciate Blackout much more the second time around. And it was interesting, you and I were talking off air, that we both kind of found very different themes in the film. For me, one of the things that jumped out at me the most, I think, is I kind of felt the film really wrangled with what addiction does to us and our relationships, to the people around us. You know, I felt that throughout the entire film, I mean, I think that the fact it's called Blackout, you know, I think the film is very much a parable about addiction, about alcoholism. You know, Charlie does talk about having problems with drink in the film, but he sort of says, oh, well, that was a thing that was a result of dealing with my dad, and I kind of moved through it. But there's this moment when Miguel offers him a beer, the character Miguel, Miguel's actually been accused of the murders that Charlie has committed. And you see this hunger in Charlie's eyes. And Charlie, of course, played by Alex Hurt, who is very, very good, and is the son of actor William Hurt. And I mention that only because in reading interviews with Fessenden, he has mentioned that Alex had a very contentious relationship with his father. I think he might have used the word explosive. I don't quote me on that, but he mentioned they had a very tumultuous relationship. Specifically, Fessenden mentioned this in an interview, and a lot of that went into Charlie's character.
Interesting.
But yeah, I think that, you know, when we're addicted to things, you know, and like, I think Charlie's a really complex character, because I think you could have made him just a tortured artist, right? He could have just been a bulk standard tortured artist, and he is, but he's tortured because of his relationship with his father. You know, we'll talk a little more about this later, but he's toxically independent. You know, when his addiction gets worse, you know, for him, when it spins out of control, which is, you know, when he's attacked by a werewolf, kind of how it's presented in the film, he can't talk to his partner about it. He just can't bring himself to do it. He just tries to solve it himself. And that kind of, again, toxic independence, that is a trauma response when you grow up not being able to count on the people around you. And again, I thought that was very well represented here.
I thought it was really interesting the way they depicted the addiction, because, you know, Charlie's character was not depicted as some sort of helpless person who is just like a two-dimensional addict, right? He was a very three-dimensional person who has moments of clarity and insightfulness, but is also, you know, can't escape the addiction, but is a very complicated but intelligent and thoughtful person who just has that longing, as you talk, that hunger. And it's also interesting because you see, like, the way, you know, with his ex-girlfriend, who you in the scene with her, you see that, you know, she wishes things could have worked out differently, but, you know, just that his addictions got in the way. And you see that sort of tension and that sort of, it wasn't just like, you know, leave me alone, I don't want anything to do with you. It was more I wanted to be in your life, but there was this barrier and it couldn't work. And he was there engaging with her, and you see that there was a love, but also kind of a hurt there. So it was a very nuanced way, I think, of presenting a very realistic sort of person who's dealing with addictions and how it's kind of wrought havoc in his life.
Yeah, it was. And I think that's such a real thing, right? This idea that you want to love someone and you're willing to help them. You know they've got stuff and you're willing to help them work through it. But their emotional baggage, their damage will not allow them to let you in. You know, you simply cannot love them the way you want to love them, the way you're capable of loving them. It's a very frustrating, very difficult thing, because you almost have to turn off your own love in a way. It's a breakup is much easier when someone says, well, I don't love you. Well, I don't love you anymore. Okay, well, fine. We'll figure it out. Or, they don't love me anymore. Well, I guess I just got to pack that away. But when you both still care for each other, but you cannot be together, that is extraordinarily difficult. And again, that's a topic not really broached in horror films. I feel like this is a skill of Fessenden's to be able to bring that on screen. And like I said, there were moments where this felt more like an independent drama than a horror film, and I really valued that. And of course, Joe Swanberg turned up at the end as her new boyfriend, and I feel like if you're going to have a 2010-esque confused adult melodrama, you got to have Joe Swanberg. And I don't mean that as a slight. Swanberg is brilliant. He's a talented director, actor. It's just he was in a lot of that kind of stuff. He's done a lot of that kind of stuff. He's very capable of doing like emotionally complex, both as a writer, filmmaker, and actor. He's very, very, very capable of that complexity. And I thought his performance as her very understanding new boyfriend was spot on, because he's like exactly the guy you end up with after the tumultuous relationship with the artist. You end up with a really staid guy he's got the emotional tools.
Yeah, I wanted to, like, when he first came on scene, I'm like, oh, this is the douchey new boyfriend. And then as the lines were delivered, like, no, he's not.
Yeah, he's trying to acknowledge her feelings and trying to help her put it, give voice to what she's feeling, but not able to vocalize. And yeah, you're like, oh, you want to hate that guy, because again, that's such a cliche, the douchebaggy new boyfriend. But no, he's just a good dude, and of course, Charlie kills him. and really, what Charlie takes, in trying to spare Sharon, and I think this is true. This is what we do. When we are toxically independent, when we try to do everything ourselves, we end up hurting the people we love even more. We think that by removing ourselves from their lives, that, no, this is going to make it better. And believe me, I've had that. Like, as someone who almost made the decision Charlie makes at the beginning of this film, albeit for very different reasons. I was not a werewolf, although I am very hairy. And I recognize now, like, that would have done much more harm to the people in my life than working through the problems I have. But Charlie sees it as like, oh no, this is the way out. It's that like almost male insistence on doing things exactly your way. And in the process, he gets his buddy shot, who, he has to make silver bullets for him. And in the end, he dies exactly the way he says he will, because the bullets he doesn't get a chance to shoot Charlie. Instead, he is shot by the police. And he takes away Sharon's new guy. He kills him. And in the end, he forces Sharon to kill him. He puts that on her. And again, that's something we do when we have addiction. We end up putting the responsibility for our decisions on other people, even though we think we're not doing that. We think we're being the tough guy. We think we're being stoic, whatever the fuck that has come to mean in the modern era. But instead, we just make everyone else do our emotional labor.
As an aside, and this one of the things on my notes, and you mentioned it, Earl's killing reminded me of Ben's death at the end of Night of the Living Dead. And I wonder how much it was a nod to that.
I assume it had to be intentional.
He sort of forecasts that, right? Foreshadows that. He even calls that, I'm going to get shot by the police or whatever. And it's one of the smaller social commentaries in the film. I think there's ones that they spend more time on, but it's certainly a social commentary in regards to that.
Yeah, and Charlie says, at the end of the film, of course, as I mentioned, Sharon does have to kill him, and the film sort of ends over his recorded messages to her as we fade to black. And one of the things he says is, I didn't want to turn myself in because I didn't want to be a lab rat. But had he done that, all his friends would still be alive. He would still be alive eventually to join their company. One day, he could rejoin that, but he could not let go of this notion that, no, I'm the one steering the ship. And I think that's something our addictions do, right? Like they mentioned the concept of Umwelt, which is this idea that creatures only have the awareness, like they only have their own awareness. They do not have the awareness of others. They can only see as much as they see. They're limited by their own perspective. And we see that with Charlie. Again, he's because he is who he is, even though he sees himself as tortured and put upon, he's blind to the systemic racism that Earl would have faced. And, putting a gun, like even the fact he says, oh, I'm going to record your murder of me. You're going to put a hand in the gun of a black guy, have him shoot a white guy on camera. And you think it's going to be okay just by having you say, this is totes cool, and then have the police turn up for a black guy holding a gun. Again, it doesn't matter if that guy's wearing a suit. I mean, was it the director Ryan Coogler? He got the cops called on him because he was cashing a check, and the guy's a fucking millionaire. He directed Black Panther and the Creed movies, and the bank called the cops because here's a black guy with a big check. You know, that's got to mean something. So the notion that Charlie would just hand him a gun and be like, "You'll be fine, bro, trust me," he's so blind to everyone else but himself, but approaching it in a way that he thinks is altruistic.
This actually, it's interesting you bring this up because this is reminiscent of something I teach in social theory. W.E.B. Du Bois's double consciousness, this idea, he talks about how, I think it's from his book, The Souls of Black Folks, how, African Americans in the U.S. in particular have always had to be vividly aware of how they're being perceived by others. There's obviously a time in the United States where if you weren't vividly aware of how you are looking at other people and how they are seeing you, you end up like Emmett Till, right? Some tragic things that have happened in our history. So he talks about how this always having to be aware of how you're seen by others creates what he calls this double consciousness for African Americans, of this knowing your own culture and how you see the world, but also always being aware of how others see you and being kind of, fluent in the culture of, the dominant group as well as your own culture. I think you can make an argument that it's not exclusive to African Americans, but it can also be to other marginalized populations like LGBTQ community, being aware of, and women being aware of sexism more vividly than men are, things like that. But it is interesting that, but also very fitting that Earl recognized these things, right, very quickly. Like, hey, what we're setting up here doesn't look good,
yeah.
Right? And for him to see that, and Charlie and Charlie's a thoughtful guy, right? He's insightful and is aware of all these issues that we're going to talk about within the community, that he's in his swan song last hurrah before he takes a silver bullet. He's trying to fix some of these social issues. He even doesn't immediately see this. So there's something there, that double consciousness that Earl's like, I know how this is going to be perceived. Are you not seeing this? Right. So the Umwelt really ties in with that in an interesting way.
Yeah. To your point, I remember reading articles about how during Barack Obama's presidency, a number of commentators noted that he really had to moderate his anger when certain things would happen, because to be too angry, even though a situation may very well warrant that anger, there is the cultural stereotype of the angry black man, and you must at all costs, avoid invoking that sort of cultural stereotype, because then people will just sometimes even people who might otherwise consider themselves socially conscious might go, ooh, I know that guy and I don't like that. And that must be fucking exhausting. I mean, I've seen a version of this in my female friends. I have female friends, like particularly my best friend. She very much like opened my eyes to what it is to move as a woman in the world. And, she talked about like guys just putting their hands on her. And I nearly lost my fucking mind, because if someone touches me and I don't want them to touch me, I go nuts. I just can't help it. It's violation of my personal space. And I mentioned this to her, and she's like, well, yeah, okay. I mean, that's a point. But she said, and over the time, of course, of our friendship, she's definitely become so much more self-possessed, and she is less willing to put up with that shit. When she was a young woman, she said, one of the dangers I'm in is if I kick up a fuss, that creates a whole other host of issues. Now I'm shrill. Now I'm no fun. I'm killing the mood instead of just rolling with it. Whereas I tell you, one dude reaches across the table and grabs another guy's balls. If I give him shit, no one's going to say, bro, you killed the vibe. They're going to say, bro, why'd you touch that guy's balls? And if I give him shit for it, they're going to be like, yeah, you shouldn't have touched that guy's balls. But you switch the genders, all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, come on. He's just having fun. What's your deal? Which is fucked up. So what were some other themes you identified?
For me, the biggest theme was this sort of microcosm of U.S. and migrant labor, right? And how the dynamics of that, how migrant labor populations are treated. You have one of the things that's going on. There's this whole kind of project that, that I think Hammond is behind. He's the developer, and Hammond, the project, is behind. And then there's this group of migrant workers who all live in this community. And, they're being disparaged, but still needed, right? And that's such the story of the migrant labor, especially, from Latin American countries in the U.S. And, certainly it's become this very polarizing political kind of thing with all this vitriolic rhetoric about migrants. And certainly, that's been very ugly in terms of that. And there's this long history there, though, of like this dependence on that labor, but while also disparaging it. But not only just dependence, but like United States it really creates this dynamic. And, the U.S. and it creates these sort of labor agreements that create the problem, like NAFTA and things like this. And basically what happens essentially is that to protect our own industry and such and our mega farms here in the country, we create these agreements that are favorable to the U.S. in terms of trade. And what happens is the small farmers in Latin American countries cannot compete with the prices of these huge farms, right, in the United States, right, that are run at scale and efficiently, but also have these trade agreements that favor them. So you have these small farmers in places like Mexico that can't afford to make a living, so they go to the city to get a job in more of an industrial sort of setting. But there's already an oversaturation of labor in those spaces, so a lot of them can't find work there. So they end up crossing the border and working in those same farms that put them out of business. Those mega farms that put them out of business depend on their cheap labor, right? Because native-born American citizens don't want to work out in the field like that. They don't want to do that work, right? An American, if you own your farm, you'll be a farmer. But like it's just for various reasons, stigmas and other things, and the low wages and the hard nature of the work, American-born workers don't want to work in the field. So we need those laborers. And we as citizens who, we also get sort of a subsidy of that. Like if you enjoy the $2 head of lettuce, right? Part of that is because of that cheap labor, right? But we don't always think about that. So we have this agriculture industry that absolutely needs that labor. And we don't have immigration policies that support that effectively. There aren't enough kind of avenues for those laborers to come here, even if even like if there were more of a temporary labor program, and I know they've had some of those in the past that they've tried, but if there were something that allowed for the workers to come here seasonally, legally, and not, become this, kind of disparaged group, that would at least be a step in the right direction. It wouldn't fix all the problems. Certainly there's some inequalities there, but we have this industry that needs that labor, and our domestic labor will not meet that need, but we don't have structures that allow for it to happen the way it needs to legally. So we have this undocumented labor that comes across, works these jobs, and then we treat those people like shit. And we make them out to be the boogeyman for all the ills of our society. When the actuality is like, any large population of people is going to have its good and bad elements. That's just the nature of humanity. But that population actually keeps their heads down because they don't want to get caught and sent back, so they don't cause problems typically. They come, they work hard, they send money back home. And often when the labor's done, they'll go back home. Sometimes they stay, but like it's a population that actually kind of keeps out of trouble a lot better than most populations in the US. But because of, racism and xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment, we create sort of boogeymen out of them. We make them the bad guys when they're really they're one of the victims in this system, right? That creates this need for the work. And there are a lot of victims in this. I mean, that's a longer conversation, but like the whole microcosm of that relationship is seen in this situation where you have these laborers there that are keeping to themselves, not causing trouble. But when there's a murder, they blame it on the migrant labor, Miguel.
Well, and I think it's important to note too that all the data suggests that those marginalized populations who are living sort of in gray areas are actually victimized at a higher rate, but they don't report those crimes because they're afraid that any kind of interaction with authorities will reveal their undocumented status. So they are likely victimized at a higher rate. But we have this notion, or not we, but well, I'm part of that group. I have to say we have this notion that, yeah, they are victimizer, not victim. And I don't, of course, to paint anyone as a victim is a broad brush, but I think it's important to use the term, like they are more likely to be sinned against than they are to be sinning. But as I say, because of their precarious status, they have to just take those hits. And I thought it was really interesting and insightful and instructive that when the group has decided towards the end of the film that Miguel must be the killer, we're just going to ask him some questions, that the white men take it upon them, these mediocre drunken buffoons, take it on themselves to assume the mantle of law enforcement. They just, because to them, the establishment is so closely aligned with their identities and what they stand for. They think, I can just become part of that. I am just de facto part of that, because I don't even think they necessarily realize why. Like if they tried to do that for say Charlie, they probably wouldn't even think to do it. But because it is a member of an out group, I feel like they feel empowered, like, we are part of that power apparatus because that power apparatus is us. And even Hammond, when he marches Charlie to the station at gunpoint towards the end of the film, he's talking about the lawlessness and the vigilanteism that's a problem in this town. And he is, in fact, a fucking lawless vigilante. He has marched a guy who has not committed any crime downtown at gunpoint. And he's shocked when the sheriff goes, well, did you beat him up? Because he just thinks he deserves to be part of the enforcement apparatus by virtue of his status.
That reminds me of kind of, the tragic and unfortunate circumstances around the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, right? They have these kind of very racist, very, as you described, mediocre white men who take it upon themselves for this vigilante kind of reaction to a guy who is, jogging, and won't get into the whole details of all that. It's been well documented. It's this very kind of self-righteous, I'm appointed to do, to enforce these laws. And, they feel like the system isn't acting swiftly enough or isn't decisive enough. Well, maybe the system is, for all of its flaws, at least exercising a little, more wisdom in taking its time in these things, and not immediately drawing conclusions based on, racism or xenophobia. The system takes a little longer to let its racism play out. But, it really is very reminiscent of that whole situation.
And I know in interviews, Fessenden has said, he sort of identified the main point of the film is how capitalism has really deconstructed the American dream. It has turned people against each other. It has concentrated wealth. It has allowed people to, or I guess in some ways forced people to sort of let go of things that would otherwise or should otherwise offend their basic humanity. And I think that's one of the things I really found kind of interesting about Charlie is he is described as, by the pastor, as a sensitive boy. And he said, it couldn't have been easy growing up with your father as a sensitive boy. As someone who grew up as a sensitive kid and as someone who struggles when faced with like bullying and oppression, I have a hard time seeing that played out in front of me. And so I can imagine being Charlie, seeing the inequity happening before you, where these guys are being paid less, they're being bullied more. The Hammond is, ignoring environmental impact studies. To a guy like Charlie, you can see the angles. You see that this is not good. You can say for the jobs, but it's only going to last so long. But these people will continue to extract value at the expense of all other things. And that, if you can see the patterns, if you can see through the bullshit to just the cold, hard justifications of it, and it's just one man using manipulation to turn others against themselves and to pervert the course of justice and to just enrich himself, that's a difficult thing to live with, and it's a difficult thing to turn off. And I can imagine, I felt like Alex Hurt's portrayal, which again I thought was exceptional, really showed a guy who's kind of trapped in this cycle, right? Because it's tough to leave your small town. It's tough to leave everything you've known, especially, for Sharon, when they were together. I mean, her roots are there. And when you're an addict, it's tough to make big changes. You're locked in a series of cycles and triggers and cycles and triggers.
There's also this element of the sins of the father, because Charlie's father kind of helped shield, right? A lot of Hammond's work. So he's kind of trying to undo the sins of his father, so to speak. And, that probably is very much related to that toxic, kind of explosive relationship that Charlie had with his late father, right? That he certainly, they had different sensibilities, that he's trying to undo the things that his father protected. And those different views of the world and different ideologies probably were kind of at the nexus of their conflict when his father was alive. So yeah, and it's interesting you talk about like kind of the effects of capitalism, and capitalism is a very complicated sort of a thing, but it absolutely drives certain behaviors, and many of them are problematic. There are some things it does well and some things it does poorly. And protecting things that are sort of the common good, right? Environmental things, for example, capitalism isn't great about that. There's a really interesting book by Jared Diamond called Collapse, where he looks at different societies, historical and prehistorical, that survived or collapsed based on environmental things and the differences and what happened there. And, there's, you have, he talks about Easter Island, right, which is uninhabited now, but like it once had trees and now it's barren. But at some point, someone cut down the last tree, and there was a point where the indigenous population saw what was going on. Now, maybe they were in a situation where they didn't have other options and alternatives other than leaving. But, when your structures kind of have these sort of motivations, and people will still see what's going on and not act appropriately. And we see that in our current environmental situation.
And I think this is where we kind of run into a little bit of the toxic masculinity, which I don't like to dwell on because it's just everywhere in culture. I mean, it's a very real problem. But, I think you have in Hammond, Hammond is the worst of us. Whatever goodness was ever in Hammond, whatever sparks of human compassion, they went out long ago. I mean, he is sort of Charlie to the nth degree. Like, he is Charlie with all the goodness burned out of him, which I think we kind of see when he talks to Sharon after her boyfriend is killed. It's all about him. It's all about, all he can talk about is his talking points. Well, this is that goddamn boyfriend of yours. If it hadn't been for him, she's terrified, but he has no comfort to offer her. He can only kind of reflect on her place in his world. And again, I think if Charlie had made it to the end of his life, I think there's a not impossible chance he could have ended up as a version of that guy. Because unless you have a real strong reality check, you just keep repeating those cycles. And I think Hammond, he uses that masculinity, that sense of, if I admit fault, if I admit that anything I've done is incorrect, I am bad and wrong and weak. So I have to double and triple down on everything. Or if I even begin to suspect you might have a point where I'm incorrect, I will change the argument, and I will do it with aggression, and I'll do it under the guise of no nonsense. This, and we see this in politics all the time now. This is like, well, I'm just straight talking, no nonsense, common sense. And it's not. It's bluster and bullshit. It's the, no, it's your fault my dick is soft of political discourse. It's like, you're not good, you're not pretty enough, that's the problem. And it drives me fucking nuts, because there's a moment where Charlie says to Hammond, you ignored the environmental impact study, and this is going to screw the future of this place over. And he goes like, oh, not for 200 years or 100 years. Oh, okay. That's still a problem. He just does that thing again that dipshits who don't actually have a point do, or they just go, oh, well, and what? And what's really goading to me about that is we have enshrined that as like a masculine thing. Like, well, I don't know what your deal is. Like, well, my deal is you're a fucking moron. My deal is that you have the rationality of a child, but you say it with a puffed out chest. So I'm meant to think there's some kind of authority behind it. And that, Hammond was, again, a really great character for that reason. I hated him so fucking much.
Yeah. Well, it ties into what we talked about in our last episode with the kind of generational inequalities with the environmental stuff, right? Pushing it out to a future generation, let them deal with the mess that I'm creating and I'm profiting from it, right? And it's very much that. Another thing that I saw with Hammond, again, another one of those things we saw as in this community was sort of a microcosm, is plutocracy, right? You saw this space where the law enforcement is very much beholden to the economic power locally, right? Whereas, laws are supposed to be the guardians and the gatekeepers and the boundary keepers of society to kind of make sure that we're, playing the way we should. But all too often what ends up happening, and we see this in, large scale government as well, is that the legal structures end up becoming the guardians of the industries, or, kind of doing their bidding. And in a very immediate, personal, and vivid way, we see the law enforcement very much beholden to that. And like, it's interesting because, Luis, the sheriff there, he's trying to do his job right, but he also recognizes his own limitations. So it's not a cliche puppet, who's doing the bidding, but rather we see a law enforcement officer who is very much limited and bound by that plutocracy, despite his best efforts to the contrary.
Yeah. And he's straight up told by Hammond in a phone conversation that we hear Luis's side of, that if you don't do what I tell you to do, I'm just going to replace you at the next election. And I am baffled by the notion, and I've known this for a while, but that law enforcement officials and judges can be elected and I understand the appointment system is not awesome, as we've seen in the last 10 years, but also the notion that you have to curry favor in order to enforce the law is bonkers. I don't even know how you square that with any kind of thought of order or rationality.
Yeah, I think there's a really complicated argument that if it works the way it's supposed to, which is part of the problem, is maybe it doesn't, that, there's supposedly this accountability that, if you have to be elected, that the people you are policing, that if you're not treating them well or right, that then you will not be reelected. Unfortunately, we see, though, that it doesn't end up working out that way.
Joe Arpaio, cough, cough.
General. Yeah, right. From my home state of Arizona.
Oh, right.
So as an aside, someone who I'm related to once worked in his office, and their job was to scour the newspapers for any mention of him and to clip out those.
Why am I not surprised, Joseph? Oh, God.
Yeah.
Well, Joseph, I think we've come to the end of our conversation about Blackout. Would you recommend the film?
I would. I think again, you need to kind of go into it looking at these larger themes, because I think as a pure werewolf story, there's not a lot of werewolfy stuff. And that side of it, as we talked about at our first watching, was a little bit, maybe felt a little slow. But these deeper themes, I mean, who would have thought we would talk, political philosophy about a werewolf film, right? But I think there's some really interesting themes that are really worth exploring at a deeper level.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I do want to shout out the werewolf transitions, particularly the one which was done in a series of Charlie's paintings. Just exceptional. I thought, I know the film was shot on a micro budget. Fessenden has not been shy about this. He's not said an actual number, but he has said that was one of the things that was kind of a compromise, and trying to find a way to express that without dumping a ton of money into the werewolf makeup more than he already had. And I thought it was a really effective method of showing the transition.
Yeah, very creative for sure.
So that's a recommend from us. You can find Blackout. It is rentable on most VOD platforms. And remember, folks, do not pirate independent films. It is a blue-eyed miracle anything gets made at this point, and you vote with your dollars. So if you want to see independent films happen and succeed, you have to support them, not just with your eyes, not just by watching them for free on a streaming service. You have to pay something. I know time's tough, but you can afford a couple bucks. You can pay $4 to $5 to get 2 hours worth of entertainment for something like Blackout. And that pays huge dividends because, again, when you buy something, you're voting with your dollars. You pay to rent something like Blackout. You are saying to distributors, I want more stuff like this. That is how we reward independent filmmakers. I don't like piracy generally, but if you're going to pirate something, pirate Avengers, pirate whatever the fuck is coming out of Disney these days, but do not pirate independent films, because there will come a time where there are no more independent films, and none of us want that. So again, you can rent Blackout on VOD platforms everywhere, and I'm excited to see whatever it is that Larry Fessenden does next. Joseph, where can everyone find you online?
Well, you can find me on YouTube at The Sociology Professor. going to be unveiling a bunch more videos over the next year. I was sharing this with you before. I've got a grant to help produce some of those. So really excited about that. And you can find me on Twitter at JOKOMO13, Jokomo13.
Fantastic. I'm Largely the Truth on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and Letterboxd. You can find my other show, The Ghost Story Guys, everywhere fine podcasts live. We tell true life stories of the paranormal and then look at it with a little bit of humor. We like to say we scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh. All music on this show is composed and performed by The Revenants. The Revenants are a project of Boston-based musician Elliot Wilder. Our theme song, Rest in Peace, is also by The Revenants from their album Music from Big Beige. Find more from The Revenants at therevenants1.bandcamp.com or by searching for them on streaming platforms everywhere. Thanks as always for joining us, folks. Make sure to tell your friends, post a review on iTunes or wherever you can, really. It would very, very much be appreciated. And until next time, remember, we're weird.
And you're weird.
So why not be weird together?
Let me rest.